sun.
I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Listen to Pavarotti. Can I be your superhero?
Hello, welcome to The Revealing. I'm your host Pavarotti, and I'm here to discuss the Idaho 4 case. And I sat around yesterday and I waited to hear something on a notice of appeal, and when I didn't hear it, I got kind of disappointed. But then I realized in that hearing on sentencing, when Judge Hippler went through and was talking about the 42-day window, one thing he made clear was he wasn't going to start unsealing court documents until that 42-day window was up. And he's been going back and forth with the prosecution and the defense on which ones to seal and unseal. And he made some determinations. And the ones that he has unsealed, though, oh my goodness. Once I started going through those, I went, okay, there's no way this is over. It's not over. I believe now one of the main things that the Kohberger team is waiting on before they try to file anything is going to be the conclusion of the investigation by the special prosecutor into the leaks. That is going to be the way back in for this to go to trial, because once that conclusion is done, that's going to be the strong, solid grounds for an appeal to be filed and actually be recognized. Because when you have an active investigation into nefariousness during proceedings heading up to trial, and they assign a special prosecutor to investigate, well, the natural conclusion would be to wait until that special investigator is concluded his investigation so they can take the results and try to exclude things from there. So it's not over. And for the people out there that say, wait till all of this evidence comes out, goodness, well, we're about to get into the actual sealed court documents that nobody wanted anybody to be able to see. And the things that you're going to see is going to blow your mind, much in the same way it did mine. We're getting into things that have been unsealed now, like FBI reports. But I need you to pay close attention as we start to go through these. I'm going to show you some things that are very profound. And it was the timing of these things which could only correlate to the defense getting them in discovery around these times, or else they would have already been admitted into evidence. And the fact that the dates on the reports don't correlate to when the defense should have got these things should make everybody's head explode. You're going to see things in this one like an FBI report. You're going to see Dr. Christian Westling's report on item Q13.1, which is the DNA under Maddie's fingernails. It's going to tell us a lot about real evidence in this case. Hold on to your hats. We're about to break down unsealed court documents now. This thing is far from over, folks. Okay, this first one is one that Hippler is fully redacted, because there was some redacted portions. I can't remember what was redacted and what wasn't. But now that it's been redacted, I'm going to focus in on what I believe is very important to the Kohberger team as far as an appeal, when it finally comes, what it's going to be about. And this was the defense's motion on July 15th in their opposition to vacate the non-dissemination order. And it's what they specifically point out in here that is key, I believe. Mr. Kohberger's request regarding the order is based on the ongoing special inquiry and the hold order for all witnesses issued by this court. A lot of emphasis has been put on the special inquiry, which is the special prosecutor, the special investigator into the leaks in this case. Then the defense has already made statements in previous documents that once that investigation is complete, then the leaked list of who'd actually leaked the information would be key to getting them removed from being a witness in the case. So some of the language points this out. In this case, substantial dangers of prejudice to Mr. Kohberger exist up to and through sentencing. As this court is well aware, there have been numerous leaks of confidential information to the press, and the avalanche of publicity continues with the release of the Peacock documentary, The Idaho Student Unalivings, the Amazon Prime series on July 11th, and the book by James Patterson on July 14th. Wow, they knew that these would be full of BS, not only full of leaks, but, lies, leaks of lies. And were they ever? Lifting the revised order now, this close to the sentencing, would only increase the media frenzy and publicity around the case. The court has issued a records hold order, and a special inquiry is ongoing. So they keep hitting on this. After the release of the May 9th, 2025 Dateline special on this case, the court issued hold orders to both parties, documents and records hold order May 15th, 2025. Lifting the revised order at this moment, given the ongoing investigation into the leaks to Dateline, Peacock, and potentially James Patterson and the Amazon Prime documentary, would only confound the efforts in this investigation into who actually violated the non-dissemination order and makes the investigators' jobs close to impossible. In its response to the media motion, the state now withdraws its request for the non-dissemination order to be continued until sentencing. The state cites further reflection and continues that, out of respect for the integrity of the judicial process and the privacy of the victims and their families, as they consider their rights to provide victim impact statements at sentencing, the prosecution team does not intend to make any public statements about this case until after sentencing has concluded. And then they go on to say the state's promise rings hollow, given the previous leaks from sources close to law enforcement. And then it gets into the conclusion, but it's obvious that something that's very on the mind of the entire defense team at this point is the investigation into who actually was the leaker in this case. And that special inquiry, I can tell y'all, is still going on to this day. So likely we're not going to see any type of action from a Brian Koberger team until this special inquiry is completed and the leaks have been identified. Then they have real grounds to file an appeal in this case. So this thing is far from over, folks. Now it's time to pay close attention and prepare for your, steam to come out of your ears. Because for those of you that have been with me as we have gone through this case, we have gone through every court doc of merit along the way, tried to figure out what the heck was going on, because a lot of things in those docs were sealed. We never got to see them. And, we talked about many times the massive discovery requests, but then as they're doing this unsealing, they're kind of going backwards. They're starting at the end and working back. So there was a specific time in this thing around early June where I would cover all this stuff that was hitting the case summary, and I'd go, what is all this? Look, we have an order from the judge, and then the judge came back and overruled his own order and ruled another way. And there was these reports, this S1A, S1B, and we couldn't figure out what all this stuff was, but we knew it was big. When you see what it was, you're going to freak out, especially when you see how the judge changed his ruling on orders when the defense actually got this discovery, and they had to get an order getting the defense granting access to this stuff. This is going to blow your mind, and this is what tells me we can't stop now. We got to keep as much eyes on this case as possible to when that special investigator finishes investigation. Media, everybody needs to be focused on when they do file their appeal, because they're going to file it. But it's going to happen as soon as this special investigation is over. And if there's not enough eyes on this thing to create the outside pressure, they'll just deny the motion. So we've got to be vigilant in this, because what you're going to see next is some of the biggest injustice that you'll ever see in this case. It's ridiculous. Watch this. Watch the story that this tells. We're going to start on June 5th, 2025. Hippler grants access to the defense for sealed court records. June 5th, 2025. Order. This is an order granting access to sealed records dated June 5th, 2025. We guessed because they put a line through May and put June, but is sealed. They sealed the order pursuant to Idaho Court Administrative Rule, and they give the rule. Now, funny enough, Hippler did not unseal this order. He unsealed his later order, but we know, just because you kept it sealed, Hippler, that you granted the defense access to these records on June 5th. And prior to this, these records were sealed and the defense couldn't see them. Now, the first record that they got access to was this independent evidence. Remember, we kept hearing there was independent evidence done in the case? Well, they got access to this independent evidence that apparently the prosecution got on April 5th, 2025. You can see it was ordered by Bill Thompson. And this was from a company called Gustav & Sons Forensic Science Services. And this is the results of an individual evidence investigation by these folks. So this was the first thing they got, and we'll talk about it. Then the second thing that the defense got access to, and you can see this was actually a stipulated motion to admission of additional exhibits at trial. And this motion was stipulated by Jennings and Taylor, 5th day of June, 2025. And what was this additional information? So the defense wanted this and the affidavit of Gustafson Sons admitted into evidence. This was a laboratory report that the defense finally got access to that had been completed when? January 4th, 2023, y'all. They didn't get access to this until June 6th of 2025. And this is the actual FBI laboratory report on things that are very, very slap you in the face. Well, we're going to see so much evidence that shows that Kohberger was guilty. No, actually what we're going to see is where the nefariousness in this case took place. And it was by the prosecution team in this case, because the FBI's reports, they got them out pretty quick, and they indemnified Brian Kohberger, y'all. But that's not where it ends, right? This came out to the defense on, they got access to it on June 5th, along with the independent evidence report from Gustav & Sons. And then you'll notice what happened next. Okay, June 5th, Hippler grants access to the defense for the sealed records. Same day, defense gets access to the FBI lab report from January of 2023 and the report from Gustav for independent analysis of evidence. What happens next? What happens next is the defense files to have these two documents entered into evidence. On June 6th, Hippler issues a sealed order admitting these two documents into evidence. But then something happens. And by the way, he doesn't unseal this sealed order for some reason, but he does unseal this order, where on the same day, later on that day, Hippler revises his order admitting these documents as evidence to adding stipulations to that order on these documents coming in as evidence. And it's quite obvious why when you look into the documents. But look at this. You can see here on June 9th, Hippler originally orders granting admission of the additional exhibits, additional exhibits as evidence at trial. So he says, yes, I order the admission of these additional exhibits as evidence at trial. But then later on that day, he comes back, because we've seen this remember we went through this in the case summary. Issue grants an order admitting evidence, and then it came back and he had an order, denying his own order. And we were like, what? How can you deny your own order? Well, this is what it entailed. Order conditionally denying admission of additional exhibits as evidence at trial. And why would you deny independent analysis of evidence done by the prosecution and an FBI lab report in any way with conditions? And you can see right here, it was a stipulated motion to the admission of the exhibits by Jennings and Taylor. But then the judge goes back, and you can see right here, the exhibits are described as the FBI lab report 4 and FBI Lab Report 12. Evidence will not be admitted until offered with the appropriate witnesses at trial, as was explained at the pretrial conference. So if the FBI didn't come in and testify to these lab reports, then the defense wasn't going to be able to even bring them up. You got to be freaking kidding me. But here's why: when you go through these lab reports from the FBI, it is egregious, y'all. But first, we're going to look at the independent analysis of evidence by the prosecution's independent investigator on item Q13.1, DNA under Maddie's fingernails. And now we finally have the answers. Okay, it's important to note that this is the company that's doing an independent analysis of evidence, and they were retained by the prosecution in the case. And this all revolves around item Q13.1, which is the DNA under Maddie's fingernails. And the results are mind-bending, y'all. But to give you a little background on, how important this is, the prosecution, before the grand jury, the secret grand jury that indicted Bryan Kohberger, they had their expert go in and say, because the Idaho State Police lab could not exclude Bryan Kohberger as a potential contributor to item 13.1, it put it in the grand jury's mind that Kohberger could have been one of the contributors to the DNA under Maddie's fingernails. The defense had their own private company do an analyzation on this particular evidence, and they said that Bryan Kohberger was to be excluded as any kind of a contributor to this evidence. So Thompson has an independent agency go through and do testing on it. And as we go through here, it talks about how they're the laboratory director for the Niagara County Sheriff's Office Forensic Laboratory, an accredited forensic science laboratory in the state of New York, providing testing services in forensic biology, drug chemistry, toxicology. This is what I reported on when this first came out: firearms and tool marks, autosomal short tandem repeat STR DNA and lineage specific YSTR and mitochondrial DNA analysis. So they seem to know what they're doing. And as we go through here, it says, I was retained by Latah County Prosecutor's Office, Bill Thompson Jr., the prosecuting attorney in the matter of Idaho versus Bryan Kohberger, to review DNA testing conducted by Idaho State Police Forensic Services, hereafter the ISP Lab, the computational analysis of the ISP data conducted by Cybergenics, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So you got the ISP Lab and you've got Cybergenetics, which is the defense's independent team, independently going over the evidence that ISP Lab did. I've reviewed the ISP laboratory report authored by Jade Miller. Well, we went into Jade Miller, remember? Dated February 6, 2023, in regards to the results of DNA testing of item Q13.1, sample from body of person A, Maddie Mogan. I have also been provided with and have carefully reviewed the discovery materials provided by Cybergenetics, including the associated case file for true allele containing the files generated during the computational analysis. Lastly, I've also reviewed the standard operating procedures and associated validation reports produced by the Idaho State Police Lab. So this just sets it up. They're doing independent analysis of the results from the ISP Lab and from the defense's independent team, Cybergenetics. And they went over the ISP Lab protocols. So we're not going to read all the ISP Lab protocols and all of their background, and they do a lot of explaining how DNA works. Crazy enough, I've researched this stuff so much throughout this case, I can actually understand this report, which is insane in itself. But as we go down here, you'll see this. It talks about referencing the ISP biology DNA casework analytical methods, December 9th, 2022. And the conclusions: the laboratory clearly defines the range in which the term inconclusive is appropriate. These values were derived based on empirical data developed by the testing laboratory through internal validation of the STR mix prior to its use in forensic casework. It reads as follows, and then it goes into what they actually look at to include and exclude as far as the likelihood ratios. But when we get down here specifically, okay, I would reasonably anticipate different results be obtained between these two systems, talking about the ISP and cybergenetics, especially when analyzing complex DNA profiles, such as partial profiles, degraded DNA, inhibition, and or complex mixtures of varying proportion as observed in the profile item 13.1. For example, for item 13.1, the application of a single global analytical threshold of 75 RFU for all color channels by the ISP lab resulted in the detection of 61 alleles across 22 comparable loci. A similar analysis by cybergenetics employing true allele and a global analytical threshold of 1 RFU with peak height cutoff of 15 RFU resulted in the detection of approximately 140 potential alleles across 22 comparable loci. So that means the independent team that the defense had, cybergenetics, found 140 potential alleles where the ISP lab only found 61. And they both looked over the 22 comparable loci. And if you, alleles are the little peaks that you see. Wait a minute. They got a little map here for us, just so y'all know what we're talking about. All right, so this is what they're going to call alleles. And when they go across this loci, these little alleles pop up as little peaks. So apparently they found a lot more alleles than the ISP lab did, which that's okay. Let's continue. Okay. So they found 140 at 22. The ISP lab only found 61 at 22. And excluding XY chromosome markers, these are 3 loci, and they name specific loci, were consistent with a mixture of at least 3 individuals, and 1 locus was consistent with a mixture of at least 4 individuals. With consideration to the victim's reference genotypes at a specific loci, this is consistent with a mixture of at least 4 contributors. With the application of the lower AT, I agree with this conclusion based on the inferred genotypes reported. The mixture is consistent with a mixture of 4 contributors. So we've got 4 contributors in the DNA under Maddie's fingernails. They're going to go on to exclude 2 of these mixtures as Maddie and Kaylee, obviously because they were sitting right next to each other at some point. But we got Maddie and Kaylee as 2. That leaves 2 unknowns at least. Potential differences in the estimated portions of victims' DNA as a major and or secondary contributor, particularly at locus D18S51, the remaining alleles in the mixture. These factors and potentially others, either individually or collectively, may account for different opinions regarding the potential number of contributors to the mixture observed from 13.1 and 2. Oh, and 2. Wait a minute. I just seen that. The potential number of contributors to the mixture observed from item 13.1 and item 2. What the heck is item 2? Reporting the mathematical weight of the evidence expressed as likelihood ratio. And then it goes on to talk about Koberger's likelihood ratio at 0.0469. And their conclusion, though, is ultimately both results, when considering the guidance from the SWG-DAM for reporting likelihood ratios, provide support for the proposition that Brian Koberger is not a contributor to the mixed DNA profile obtained from item 13.1, albeit with different mathematical weights. So the independent analysis of evidence shows Koberger is excluded versus being able to not exclude him from the ISP evidence. And that's Thompson's independent investigator into the case. My findings here are based upon my analysis and interpretation of the ISP laboratory DNA test results, resulting Promega PowerPlex fusion system employing the Osiris Analyst software for item 13.1. Sample from body of Maddie Mogan, reference sample from Maddie Mogan, reference sample from Kaylee G, and reference sample from Brian. Additional items were tested by the ISP lab, but not reviewed or discussed herein. I'd like to know what those additional items that were tested were. But as you go through this, you'll see that they determined that item 13.1 contains approximately 1.3% male DNA, consistent with a mixture of at least 4 contributors, at least one of whom is male. Maddie Mogan cannot be excluded. Kaylee cannot be excluded. Brian Koberger was excluded. So we can likely determine from these lab results, just like they did, that Maddie was likely a contributor to 13.1, the DNA under her own fingernails. Kaylee was likely a contributor because of her proximity to Maddie. And there was an unknown male or males that were a component of 1%, which means there's a female and there's a male unknown contributors to this. And based on the quantity of DNA amplified for 13.1, which was 1.5 nanograms, which would be 1,500 picograms, total human DNA, of which approximately 20 picograms is male DNA. So that 20 picograms, that's a lot of picograms. That must have been a pretty dang good sample under Maddie's fingernails. I would there anticipate that the minor male DNA component to the mixture is barely above the detection threshold, but yet it's above it. So that means they can absolutely include or exclude people based on Maddie's fingernail DNA. But we know one thing, Brian Koberger wasn't one of them, but there's at least one female and one male that nobody can figure out who it was. And I bet based on those results, because they're going to continue to go through these things and talk about the complex mixture. And then they get right here. Based on the interpretation of the mixed DNA profile observed, Brian Koberger was excluded as a potential contributor to the mixed DNA profile. However, the person that wasn't excluded, they did a lineage match. It's 101,000 times less probable than a coincidental match to an unrelated Hispanic person. So it wasn't a Hispanic person. 68,000 times less probable than a coincidental match to an unrelated Caucasian person. So they weren't Caucasian and they weren't Hispanic, but it's also 5,000 times less probable than a coincidental match to an African American person. So that's interesting. It gets closer to African American. But one thing they didn't put in here, y'all, was what probability it was to a match to an American Indian. And I bet you that one would have been right on the money. But this right here should be the biggest bombshell that should be reported on in every media outlet. But nobody's going to cover it because I had to dig through mountains of pepper to find this fly shit. And we know now that the DNA under Maddie's fingernails, according to the independent lab ordered by Bill Thompson himself, on the DNA consisted of likely four contributors. Two of them, Maddie and Kaylee themselves. One is an unknown female and the other is an unknown male. But not only an unknown male, we can eliminate so many suspects in this case based on the unknown male's profile. And that is, it's 101,000 times that it's not a Hispanic person. 68,000 times that it's not a white boy. It's not a white boy, y'all. So all these frat boys that are white boys, you can eject, get rid of them. They're not in this. 5,000 times less probable is not an African-American person. So that means it's likely not an African-American person. It's likely not Demetrius, but it's likely going to be somebody that's on a on a scale close to the makeup of an African-American person, and it's an unknown female. And by unknown female, it means it's not Dylan or Bethany, because they're known females in this. And the unknown female that attacked Xana, as we went over in the autopsy reports, that person would have had to fight Xana. 50 plus defensive stab wounds. They would have been injured. Dylan and Bethany showed no injuries. So we know it's an unknown female. We know it's an unknown male. It's not a white boy. It's not Brian Koberger. It's not 90% of the frat boys. And when I say I'm way ahead of everybody in this investigation, it's because I am. Now, eventually this thing will go to trial. I mean, it will go to trial. It won't just be an exoneration. It's going to go to trial. And everything that opens up to us says it's going to go to trial. But now I know the 42-day window, that wasn't the mechanism. The mechanism is the completion of the investigation by the special prosecutor into the leaks. And going back and looking at how the motion to continue was worded as it related to the leaks. And we know it was a really big deal when Hippler in court said, we're going to, start a special investigator, special prosecutor into these leaks. We knew that would have impact. That is what the mechanism is. They wanted to get all the mainstream moron stuff out of the way with all their fake reporting and their documentaries of lies, have the special investigator complete the investigation, find the leaker, and then that leaker will be excluded from being able to testify to evidence in this case. That is the game. So as soon as that special investigator's investigation is over, we'll see movement by Brian Koberger's team. Now, that's just part one. Tomorrow, I'm going to go over the second part to this, which is what they unsealed that had been sealed since January of 2023 in the FBI's analysis. And that's what they wanted to attach as the evidence in the case that the judge ruled on and then unruled on. And it's even more astounding. But one thing at a time. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Post your comments, thoughts, criticisms. Till next time, Pavarotti is out.
Until I